My name is Jasmine Tarkeshi, and I live in San Francisco, California. That's home right now, and it's really home. My home studio is there that I run and practice in daily. And my family's there. My whole family's there. I live with my husband and my daughter, Indigo, and my mom is there, and my sister's there. It's the first time I've been so close to my family, because I did move many, 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 many miles away and felt like I had to create my own family apart from my blood family. So to have them both come back and be joined in the same place, my spiritual family at Laughing Lotus Yoga Studio, and my blood family, my mother and my sister, along with my new family, is just, it's beautiful. It's a wonderful integration, and it's home. Well, yoga found me probably when I was first born. Might have been one of my first words. So yoga found me, and I ran away from yoga as fast as I could, because it was something that was practiced at home. I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Iran. My father's Persian, and my mother's American. And so just that mix in itself was very interesting to grow up in, and also in the Middle East. During the time in Iran when I was growing up, it was a very interesting time there. So there were a lot of Westerners coming through, and a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll was happening at the time. So it's not what we generally think of as Iran, really fundamentalist, political feeling in the air. It was, everything was blown wide open. Yogis were traveling through on their way to India. And that's what I grew up in. I grew up kind of like in a commune, and everything went, and there were lots of semi-famous people coming through, and lots of people standing on their heads, and lots of people naked, and a lot of people doing everything at the same time. So, so that was how yoga found me. I remember doing sun salutations when I was a little baby. I grew up with pictures of Hindu deities everywhere, and of course, when we moved back to the States in '79, when the revolution happened in Iran, all of that was still where I lived, and I was so embarrassed because kids would come over, and I'd be like, what are those monkey people and the elephant people? And they would just laugh because we just sat on the ground. We had no furniture. Everybody sat. And of course, my name and everything around it. I hated it. I wanted to be anybody else than who I was. I had so much shame for how I grew up, and barely any schooling, and so I just wanted to fit in, and so I went as far away as I possibly could from yoga, to the point of making up like where I grew up and how I grew up, and really wanted to create an identity for myself. So that identity took me far away from my family. After spending time in New York, which is where my mom was from, the whole family migrated over to San Francisco, and as soon as I possibly could, I moved back to New York, which is where my grandmother lived. I wanted to be as far away from my family, like I said, as I possibly could. I wanted to be American, and I wanted to fit in, and I wanted to, again, do anything to just get away from myself. So that included everything. Like I said, creating false identities, which was really painful, along with everything else that goes along with that, used every sort of substance to get away from myself, from drugs to alcohol, and then even a very self-destructive path of dance and the performing arts. It wasn't something that was a positive influence. Again, it was just to beat myself up even more, and I was never going to be good enough, you know. And so living in New York City by myself, run of the mill, and I could do anything. I worked at nightclubs till 5 o'clock in the morning, and it was fun. I do have to say it was fun. It's kind of before you take out your violins. I had a lot of fun. And oh my God, you know, those days in New York were just fantastic. I got the opportunity to really dance with, perform, wait on in clubs with some of the greatest creative people of our time, you know, stars like Prince I would have dinner with. So it was really awesome. But I did start to move further and further away from myself. And that's when I found yoga for myself. That's when I found yoga. And, you know, in different ways, I started to practice on my own at Integral Yoga in the West Village. I was about 18, I would say, 19, 18. And I worked at the store there and would also go practice. And it was very reminiscent of my childhood. Everybody had names like Nataraj and Satya and Ganesh. They were all really wonderful. They all had their Swami gear on, and so it felt comfortable. It felt like home. There was carpets on the ground, and you inhale Cobra and exhale Shavasana. The practice was very simple, and I was used to a very dynamic dance life, but there was something there. You know, there was something that connected me a little bit deeper to myself, the self that was beyond the self, the external self that I was trying to run away from, but a peace that existed. And slowly by slowly, I did start to shed some of those things. I started to come out more about who I was to people and started to make peace with my past, and the integration began to happen a little bit more. And, you know, I would just always dip back in. I would always dip back in to yoga. And one day, I don't even know how, I think it was a friend of mine that I grew up with. His name is Duncan Wong. He's a pretty celebrated yoga teacher. He was one of the cats I grew up with as a kid. And he was doing yoga when we were kids. He would be doing yoga in the bars where we were hanging out. But he had rolled through New York, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to go and teach at this place called Jiva Mukti. And it's in the village, which is where I lived. And so I started to get intrigued, and I went, and it was, you know, it really was love at first Om. You know, not only did they continue to, you know, bring forth these teachings that I really needed, that really spoke to my suffering, you know, my intense suffering, while at the same time having a really joyful contemporary practice with music that I loved. It was so wildly creative. Sharon, Gannon, and David Life were village people. I worked at Life Cafe, which was David Life's cafe, deep in Alphabet City, Avenue B and 10th Street. And it was, you know, the first time that I felt like yoga was a part of my life. You know, that really spoke to the times, and I fell in love with it. And I kept going back. I would take hiatuses because my life would take me away. But I would come back, and I was still doing lots of different types of pranayama, not necessarily this kind, if you know what I mean. And different types of, you know, all of it. But I would come back until slowly those things left me. I guess the biggest what really set me forward onto my path was actually the death of my partner at the time. So I really woke up from that. It was a real rebirth. It happened to be an expression of just the death from all those parts of myself that I needed to let go of. And it was pretty much like this. It was the experience of this person never coming back. You know, one day here and the next day gone, and feeling life, even though I was still in my 20s, so I was still young, but became conscious of the sacredness of our life and how fleeting it is, and chose to really dedicate my life to waking up. And that's really where the practice started for me, because I took it on as my own. That's something that was part of my life, but that I really embraced, and it started from there. So that's how yoga refound me, or I found it, or we collided together in New York City, one of the least likely places. We opened up Laughing Lotus, in 1999 was when the doors of the first joint opened. We had been searching before. I met Dana Flynn, one of the greatest inspirations of my whole life. She used to walk into Jiva Mukti, like just wild. Again, like not so much the yoga that I was thinking of, or a yogi. She'd go, Jai Ma! She was just colorful and wild and eccentric. And again, reminiscent of what I came from. I had tried so hard to tame myself and to be this person that I wasn't, and here she was just with her presence blowing everything wide open. So I just fell in love with her spirit, and we met and we started hanging out together a lot. We really became a little more, closer. She was doing the Jiva Mukti teacher training then. I was still dancing and figuring out my life and waiting tables, and slowly moving my life away from those things. And I'd also had some surgeries, so I couldn't practice that much anymore, and I started to move away from that, from Jiva Mukti and my teachers. So I was at the gym. I was at Crunch because I had to do all of these physical therapy things. And Sharon Gannon actually taught there at the first Crunch gyms, if you know what those are. Really fun. Again, bringing this great spirited flavor to workouts. So it was a perfect place for Jiva Mukti to be. And as Jiva started to get bigger, she had turned her class on over to Dana. So one day I popped in to class, and yeah, it was it was an experience, because Dana again took it even further to kind of blow what we thought yoga was wide open. So at first I was, this isn't yoga, or this isn't how I want it, really attached to the way that I wanted my practice to be, but found such freedom, and mostly in just laughter and letting go. So that's how we met. And we started just sharing our shared love for music, the same music, for partying hard, but neither of us was drinking. So we're like, where can we go to hang out and party? Because back then they were still smoking in the clubs and dancing, and we loved New York City nightlife, and we loved to enjoy food, and even though we were both, I'm vegan and vegetarian, and loved India and had so much great shit. So we just got together and we got to play and we got to have fun and be yogis at the same time. So that was really wonderful, and where it all stemmed from. And when we started doing our own practice, with me with my dance background, of course it brought elements of specific choreography into it, repetition of movement. And, once we started getting on the mat, and again, we would do kind of old school asana. We'd be in warrior two. And then we'd say, well, what would happen if we took hands open and found a mudra or a gesture? Because we love expression, to kind of incorporate some of the other practices that we had found into the old school. We thought, would Indra throw down his lightning bolts, and would we fall onto the ground like Hanuman because we were disobeying? So we tried it and nothing happened. We were like, hey, this actually feels kind of awesome. We're like, well, what would happen if we did this? And what would happen if we did that? I have a love for the chakras and just this evolution and these ancient practices and teachings. And so we started to really begin, it just became an organic unfolding. And again, with the real honor of Vinyasa Krama, which means wise progression. So we started to create this, sometimes it's called creative vinyasa, but it's really through this lineage of Sri Krishnamacharya. The more we started reading about him, the more we realized he was a creative genius, what we consider traditional yoga, and don't veer from it. Iyengar, Ashtanga, both were born out of the womb of Krishnamacharya, which contains yoga asana, but mostly gymnastics and wrestling. Because at the time, that was what was happening at the Mysore Palace. So he was this creative genius of taking what was around him, different modalities. What we consider chaturanga is a push-up. We think this is this ancient practice. It's not so ancient. And it's a Western family. So the more we started reading about yoga at the Mysore Palace and how creative it was, it just began to give us permission to follow in those ancient teachings. We weren't trying to create something new. It was to follow in this tradition, that yoga was always there to take the teachings and to be able to serve the present and to use what was happening. So how could we take, something from 2,000 years ago, keep its incredible purpose and meaning of liberation and freedom, but to find things that were right here in our lives that could do the same thing, along with different traditions. I grew up in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of Shambhala meditation. My mother's teacher was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, an incredible teacher, but also a huge pioneer in adapting the practices to serve Westerners. How could you take this enclosed Tibetan practices and then make them accessible? So that's where we started to just follow our bliss, and we got kind of the cosmic blessings of our ancient teachers on both sides to go for it. So we started teaching, it wasn't called Lotus Flow then, at Crunch, and people started digging it and they wanted more, and we did a teacher training. They're like, but we want to train with you guys. And nobody was doing their own teacher trainings then, or making up their own yoga studios or opening up their own. So we were like, okay, let's do a training. And we started to invite all of our favorite teachers who were passionate about all these different aspects of their modalities, Sanskrit and mantra, and started to incorporate them. Right? So they started to, all these different kind of divisive practices begin to make their way together and be integrated. Because at the time too, people were saying, my yoga is better than your yoga. Not so far from religions, and the yoga practices were all so separate. We just wanted to bring everything together. So we started to use a little bit of Kundalini and how they use music and wild movement and all different, and the chakras and everything. Along with Sharon and David's, no doubt, huge influence of weaving the sacred teachings and using music. So we were teaching at Crunch. We were doing a teacher training, and then we started to have these rooftop yoga classes because we were looking for space and we couldn't find any. We didn't have any money. We had $5. So we couldn't really open up a big space, but we went up into the Greenwich House, which is a really, really famed place in New York, where from Ellis Island, all the different refugees even would come from all different traditions. So it has this incredible historical history to it. And we wanted to find a space in there to teach our classes, but we couldn't afford them. And I was like, but we've got this rooftop. If you want to practice. And it was a summer. We were like, hey, why not? And on the top of the roof, we opened up and there was this giant playground and squishy floors. So it's like for kids on playgrounds, they have squishy floors so that they don't bonk their heads too much. So we just decorated it with flowers and hung up lights and started to have these rooftop yoga classes a couple times a week, and people came. And more people came. And then they were packed out somehow, like the Village Voice wrote us up. You know, there was no internet back then. How are people going to find out? We had little cards and we'd pass them out or talk about them in Crunch. And it was just magical. It was just magical and fun. And we loved that spirit of community. We gathered together. And then it got cold. And everyone's like, you have to find a space. And we did. We started looking, and right around the corner from where we lived in the village, right sandwiched between Stonewall and the duplex, two big old nightclubs, was this little tiny brownstone. And on the very bottom floor was a jazz club. It was called the 55. And, you know, just awesome jazz musicians. Late night, I don't know what was going on down there. There was like a speakeasy. I mean, all sorts of action, man, was going down there. I was even like, one day, I'm not going to figure it out. Not to tell anyone, but I was just intrigued. Because after hours, so you would see people go in, but then there was no one in there. So it was awesome. That really excited me. Because again, it was just part of this raunchy life that I still loved. And there's Sheridan Square across the street where there's the catcalls and the drug deals. Everything was going down there in the village. And then right smack in the middle was our first Lotus. It was a little jewel box, just a studio apartment. And the little kitchen was where we signed people in. There was maybe room for 17 mats. And we're like, okay, let's start our classes. We had a little sandwich board. Downstairs it said live jazz, so we had our sandwich board and said live yoga. And we had our schedule like 10 a.m., Jasmine. You know, we just had names like Slow Flow, Vinyasa. It hadn't been really that formed yet. And then it came to naming the joint. What on earth are we going to name this thing? So we loved all the Sanskrit names and everything, but we really wanted to call on something that would welcome everyone, that we didn't have to change our name to Shakti Bhakti to be yoginis. We could actually be who we are. And you know, when we started thinking about what was it really about the practice, and laughter and joy, and my favorite mantra that actually I have tattooed on my arm, and it's tattooed across the front of the Lotus in San Francisco, is Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. May all beings everywhere be happy and free. And may my life help to contribute in that way. May I make other people happy and free. And that was the only thing that we wanted to do. Right? Just to share happiness and freedom, everybody's birthright with who they were. So we knew kind of like laughter, happy, free, and then also the symbol of the lotus kept coming up for us. As being in the middle of the mud and the muck, like whether it was your own life or New York City or whatever it was, in the midst of it is this beautiful fragrant flower that actually grows out of the mud and uses kind of the grist for the mill. And it blossoms beautifully and fragrantly without a drop of mud on it. right? So that we could exist free, could exist happy. We didn't have to go anywhere to experience it. It could be right there where we were. So that became the calling. We wanted to share. We wanted to share the joy that we experienced with others, and created that space for it. And yeah, that's what people came. We were very surprised. All right, now, my most profound practice is that of motherhood. It's really my yoga. It's really where I get to deepen my practice. My daughter is my guru, absolutely. To keep me on my path, I get to really put my practice into action in a real way. And I've always felt like I've done that, and really wanted to dedicate the rest of my life to yoga and its teachings, and to share it with everyone. So, and I never wanted to be a mom. I never wanted to be a mother. I never thought I could be a mother. I didn't think I was prepared to be a mother. All my youth, and yeah, never thought of it as a path, and especially as a yogini, first through traveling and teaching, and I was very selfish about my practice, and then through teaching, people call me Jasma since I can remember. I had all the children I could use. But, from a very young age, I could barely care for myself, so how could I be responsible for another human being? But then I remember in my 40s, started to feel like, wow, like I actually like who I am now. I'm not as crazy as I used to be. The yogas really took hold, and I enjoyed it, and could really care for myself. I had moved back to San Francisco from New York. Dana and I wanted to open up a spot in San Francisco, as well as in New York. Dana's from San Francisco, and I had grown up there and felt like I wanted to go back to dedicating and healing the relationship with my family, although I love them a lot. So I started to spend more time in San Francisco. So creating the spot there just lent itself to being at home. And I started to change. And less wanted all these external things, even in my practice and in my teaching. I'd been traveling around the world, and I love that. I feel most in my element when I'm not on the planet. When I'm traveling, when I'm here, when I'm there, but never really grounded. I've never felt comfortable just in one place. But that started to happen a little bit more, and I was ready to settle down in every sense of the way. And so yeah, obviously when I met my partner and I found out I was pregnant, nobody could have been more surprised than me, by the way. I was 43 years old. But I was overjoyed, just because I had never thought of it as an option. Ever, 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 ever. So it was like a little miracle. But it was rough all the way through pregnancy. It was a difficult pregnancy. It had to be a lot of surrender, a lot of letting go of what I felt my yoga had to look like and my life had to look like. And so there was a lot of tapas in there, a lot of challenge, a lot of shedding again of identity. This identity that I had built as a yoga teacher. I was a mom, and I was emotionally a mess, and I was back to kind of just like, so having having my daughter now, is the greatest joy of my life, but it's the deepest practice as well. It's the deepest practice of staying present, and being there with her. She happens to be, just an incredible being, so fun, so alive, and beautifully compassionate. She's got this big heart. She's really empathetic. She's a Cancer, so she's got a lot of feelings, which is great, because I get to experience them with her and to be brought in my body and in the world. And again, having the experience of being the yogi in the world and in the most mundane things at first, of changing diapers to making food. And it was a challenge. But then making everything sacred, and I'm back to cooking and making beds and cleaning the house pretty much 24 hours a day. And no, there's not much time for me time in there, because everybody's like, don't you get me time? And at first I was like, I don't get me time, because I never get me time, whatever that means. But then I realized it's all me time. What a freaking gift. You know, when I'm with my baby, it's me time. I get to have me time when I'm with her. You know, when I'm teaching, it's me time. When I'm running the studio, it's me time. Every single moment gets to be me time instead of my precious me time. I do try to create that time for my sadhana. It's not a perfect 4:30 in the morning every single day like it used to be. Again, it's messy. Sometimes it's 20 minutes. Sometimes it's an hour or longer. Sometimes it's at weird times of the day. I take a lot of classes. So that's a huge letting go. But once I began to shift it to it's all an expression and experience of who I am, it's bliss, and it's yoga. It's my yoga. It's a connection to who I am. I'm really passionate now about yoga and activism and social activism, and where they're one, where they're really, really, really one. I started out when I was 14, and I was an activist. I loved to protest. I like to use all of that, even anger that I had inside me, to fight. I was against the system, and was pissed off. And so I fought a lot for human rights, for animal rights, but there was a lot of anger associated with it, of course. And I think anger is very, 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 very positive energy. I do feel at first you have to get pissed off about things in your own life before you can make change, and in the same way about what we're dealing with the world. But yoga is activism. Yoga is called Kriya Yoga. It's a path of action. It's not pacifist. Sometimes we think like, oh, I'm just going to find my peace and quiet, and I'm going to use, and absolutely, that's so important. But yoga's main concept is that we're not separate from the rest of the world. So I'm not just going to do a practice for myself to be happy and free when other beings aren't happy and free, because we're one. And I do believe it's an organic movement when we're practicing our yoga, because the more we tune into who we truly are, this true self is one with everyone. So we can't help it because we see ourselves in everyone. And we want to act in ways that are going to organically be of benefit for others. But it does need to be a little bit more conscious, because the yogis were always the rebels. The yogis were always the ones that fought against fundamentalism and said, listen, God lives inside of you as you. All the Upanishads, all of it, is about this, going back to nature, going back to, we can think, what, 5,000 years ago? Wasn't everybody just living in a hut? But no, not much has changed. So we see great, great, great yogis like Gandhi, using his practice in a way that was to liberate everyone. Amma, who's my SadGuru, let's just say found her samadhi and, embraces the world. She doesn't see any separation. Everything she does is to bring, is to lessen the suffering of others. So For me, it's a little bit more conscious. I have, through Laughing Lotus, since day one, there's been Love Saves the Day is my organization, in which there's classes all throughout the week, our community classes, and my particular class, Love Saves the Day, which is yoga and activism combined, that goes to benefit a different organization, locally, globally, that's doing incredible things for the environment and for people. Because although we can fight so much for animal rights, human beings are treated so terribly as well. We're a little bit further removed from them. And of course, we fight for environmental justice. But I'm really, really passionate about all that we can do for other human beings on this planet, the planet, animals, all beings. Even before I became a mom, this was like my mama tigress energy. And I used to do a lot of personal activism, so really work in the field. But as I opened up the center, I start to feel like, this yoga is becoming so just condensed here, and I didn't have as much time to get out. So that's where Love Saves the Day comes. Like, how can I be of service right now with what I have, which is people coming, so I can educate them, I can help them get involved in volunteerism and educate them to what's happening, let's say in the seas. One of the organizations I support in a big way is Sea Shepherd, and they're just like no joke, and they're out there in the seas with our, fighting for our marine system. And the marine ecology and our oceans and our waters, but nobody really knows what's going on there. So I remember I used to put up pictures we had a big mural, and still do, of the Love Saves the Day of the month. So every month it's a different organization. There's pictures of dolphins bleeding, and seals, and sharks, and dolphins, and just. And Dana and everybody was like, Jasmine, do we have to see that on our way into the yoga class? I was like, yes, of course we do. And yes, because people were, of course, they were a little bit horrified, but we have to see what's happening to where there's real compassion. And hearts begin to open, and minds begin, and we just get to see, and it's ignorance of not knowing really what's happening in different parts of the world as we're get to be in our little yoga bubble. So of course, personal practice for our own happiness and freedom, this tapas. But I really feel like there's no yoga if we don't share it, right? Or at least live in a way that's of benefit to others. Those others can be the people that we share our house with, because I can certainly be accused of that, of doing all this work for others, but be a real grump and a grouch to the people who are closest to me. And I have to remember it starts at home with my partner. As well as, people who are suffering so intensely. So thank you for letting me share on this, because I do believe it's the new step in modern yoga, and I do believe it's catching. But we need our voices, we need the yogis' voices, and these practices that call on us to fight as the greatest epic battle, the Bhagavad Gita, takes place between those forces. And what should we do? Do we take action or do we not? And at the end, Arjuna fights, and especially now during this Kali Yuga, we need the yogis fighting, not with machetes, and but with our nonviolent protests, but being outspoken about it, and trying to find ways, I think, in yoga class, without just sitting there, and people do come to feel great, but how we can begin to weave this message in it. I think it's the yoga.